remember that as you've got the chronology in front of you, Ezra and Nehemiah sits in the whole canon of 39 different books, pretty much in the middle, but the history of it is pretty well right at the tail end. It connects with Haggai and Zechariah because Ezra and Nehemiah, but particularly Ezra, Haggai, and Zechariah are all working toward the same thing, which we'll bring up in a minute. And also, along with that, you have Esther and then Malachi. Remember, I told you the interesting spot that Esther sits in the canon of Scripture. Again, you just can't break books up like this, but Ezra that we're going to be looking at is essentially divided in half. So you've got Ezra 1 through 6, and then you've got 7 through 10. And in between 6 and 7, there's actually a few decades. And in those decades, that's where the book of Esther sits historically. But again, you can't just do that in the text. So they had to put Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. But just realize in history, that's where it sits. Along with these writers, Zechariah and Haggai filling in those gaps as well. And then ultimately at the end, Malachi. But Malachi is after some period after. The issues that Malachi address really aren't the issues of Ezra or Nehemiah or even Esther for that matter. So in Ezra, starting off these first 3 chapters, of course, what's the big happening in Ezra 1 through 3? What's the big event? They're going what? They're going back into the land. They're going back to Jerusalem, and this is our best knowledge of how they got back. Notice you'll see that these are color-coded with green and with red. The green one is Sheshbazzar and Zerubbabel. That's Ezra 1 through 6. Then 7 through 10, that's Ezra. And then shortly thereafter is Nehemiah. And those are the routes that they took. So you can't just go directly. This seems very time-wasting. Can't go directly. Why can't you go directly? Why can't you go directly? Why can't they just directly go? Why couldn't they down here in Susa or Nippur or in Babylon, why can't they just go due west to Jerusalem? It's what? Enemies actually is a good answer, but there's also something else that's very daunting. It's what? It's desert. So you had to go north. You had to go, this is, what do we call this today? That route, that arc. The Fertile Crescent. So they had to travel along the Fertile Crescent because it's the only way you could make a trip of months long and actually live through it. Can't go straight across because of the desert, number one. Number two, a close second probably would be dealing with people that maybe you didn't want to deal with. So anyway, this comes to the route that they took. This comes to the trip that they took. This comes to the fact of them getting to Ezra chapter 3. They are there. How many people came back, by the way, in Ezra chapter 3? Or in Ezra chapter 2? We looked at this last time. 42,000, by far the largest of the 3 groups who came back from captivity. The other two groups in number weren't even close. So over 42,000 people who made this trip. They get back to Ezra chapter 3, and to their credit, what did they begin to do? Because we talked about theoretically, if we were all if we were all in charge, we'd do this or this or this. And what did they do in Ezra 3? They laid the foundation of the temple. And the people who were young thought what about it? It was wonderful because they didn't have what? They didn't have it in captivity. By the way, in captivity, when we get to the New Testament era and we're dealing with Jesus and Peter and Paul in the book of Acts, this just appeared out of nowhere. But the origin of it is in this period right now when they were in captivity. So what what formative idea happened during the captivity that just appears out of nowhere in the New Testament? Synagogues. Synagogues. In lieu of a temple, what would they do? They would band together in little congregations, so to speak, in little synagogues, and this is where this concept was born. So they go back to Jerusalem, and of course they're all excited because they get to now worship in the way of their forefathers. So the younger ones were excited. What about the older ones? They what? They weren't. Why were they not impressed? Yes. Because one thing that Solomon had was a lot of what? Money. You know, how we would measure it, gold, silver, bronze. I mean, he had a lot of money. And when you've got a lot of money, you can build something really, really nice. They came back from captivity. Although there were a lot of them, they barely had what when they came back from captivity? And chapter 2 mentions this. They barely had stuff to put in it. That sounds more, I made it a little bit more dire than it was. They did have all of these utensils. And remember, how many of the utensils were there? I mean, it's not like they just had one box of it. How many were there? There were thousands of them. But literally, they came back, and pretty much the only thing they had were the utensils that you use in the service. Sure, they had livestock. They had some gold and silver, but nothing like Solomon would have had. Therefore, the foundation of the temple itself, unfortunately reflected that. And it caused a lot of people to be very, very disheartened. Now, if we get through all of this lesson, we'll get to one of the reasons why you could say that the people were discouraged and that stopped the work. That could have played a part of it, but when we get into the next lesson, which will be chapters 4 through 6, we'll start seeing the real reason why they had to stop working on the temple for about 20-ish years or so. But this lesson, this idea that we're looking at now, is just the concept of being stirred up. So God stirred up who? In chapter 1, verse 1. God stirred up Cyrus. God stirred up Cyrus. So think about God stirring up. God stirred up the Assyrians. And what did the Assyrians do from 1 Chronicles chapter 5, verse 26? The Assyrians took away Israel. They also, again, in kind of moving through secular history, the Assyrians would have been the rod of God to be able to take care of the enemies of the children of Israel at that time. So they received their punishment, but so did Israel because of what they had done through the hand of the Assyrians. This all works toward the grand concept of what in the Scriptures? The what of God? The providence of God. God stirs up also the Medes. Isaiah chapter 13, verse 17. Who did the Medes take care of? The Babylonians. Remember, the book of Habakkuk. Habakkuk is just distraught. Why? Why was Habakkuk so distraught? He looks around at his people. Here's a righteous person called to be a prophet. He looks around at all of his people, just distraught that they're so what? So sinful. And God responds to him. This is interesting. It's the only prophet where you've just got this back and forth, almost like a court case. Haggai makes the charge and then God answers it. So God says, look, don't worry, I'm going to take care of it. And he learns that how's God going to take care of it? How's God going to fix all of the sin that Habakkuk sees around all of his countrymen? He's going to use the Babylonians. Well, Habakkuk isn't very happy with that because then what does he come back and say? Wait a minute, they're worse than we are. But then kind of the end of it, the end of the discussion before you move on to Habakkuk's little song of praise in chapter 3, which is beautiful. It's like literally reading a psalm. The point was the Babylonians are going to get what they deserve too. Because God is always what? He's always just. Remember the mantra that I've repeated many, many times. You need to remember it. God judges nations in time and individual men and individual mankind in eternity. So God stirred up the Medes to punish the Babylonians. That's just the way that God deals with things in His era of time. He also stirs up others, and I've got examples here. As He had stirred up others, sorry about that. In 2 Chronicles chapter 21, verse 16, He stirred up the Philistines and the Arabians. In Isaiah chapter 9, He stirs up Rezin of Syria. In chapter 19, verse 2, He stirs up the Egyptians. In Jeremiah chapter 50 and verse 9, He stirs up great nations, against the children of Judah. So the whole point is God stirs up people. And the question is, why does God stir up people? Why is this needed? Why is this necessary? We get complacent. Why does God have to stir up the human will? Because God has a will to be done. So this is how He stirs it up. Now, these people of Ezra's day needed stirring up. What does Ezra chapter 9, verse 9 say? Ezra chapter 9, verse 9. We've already made the point, but now we're just going to kind of solidify the point by actually seeing it in Scripture. What does Ezra chapter 9, verse 9 say? Okay, so to bring the temple back, that was going to be Ezra's job. To rebuild the walls, that was going to be whose job? Nehemiah's. But God had to stir that up. And again, that we kind of ask the question, why do we need stirring up? Now, the means by which they're stirred up is different. We can talk about the means in just a second. But the answer as to why we need stirring up never changes. All throughout biblical history, all throughout the last 2,000 years of history, that has never changed. And so as we kind of think about this, we have the idea of being complacent and some other words that are sometimes used in the Bible. Complacent, settled, apathetic, indifferent. What does that mean? It just don't care. Just don't care. We get to the point where we don't care. So what does God do? He stirs us up. He stirs us up. Sometimes we get to the point where we are selfish. In Haggai. Now remember, Haggai and Zechariah came along, and they were the two prophets who really stirred the people to get back to work on the temple. So in Haggai chapter 1 and verse 4 and also in verse 14, what was his point? What were they doing? They were building their own houses. So they were essentially what? Thinking about themselves. In fact, Haggai even mentions in these two passages that they were building nice homes, but the house of God lay in neglect. It lay in ruins. That's a good, for all of the guys who go out and preach, a good outline, does your house lay in ruins? Because sometimes we get so complacent about what's the most important thing that we leave the house in ruin. Other things look great. Other things are fantastic. But the actual foundation of the house lay in ruins because we just don't care enough. We're too selfish about other things. That makes a really, really good outline. Challenging times. Matthew chapter 24 and verse 12. What was the context of Matthew chapter 24 where Jesus had said they were going to come to a time it was going to be so challenging that it might just wipe some people's faith out? What was happening in Matthew 24 verse 12? The destruction of Jerusalem. And what does he say in Matthew 24 verse 12? I'm sorry? Love of many will grow cold. And remember the rough time frame, you have Jesus saying this somewhere around 30 AD. The city's going to be besieged and then fall in 70 AD. So you've got a long time for people to kind of hang on to these promises. Not the longest in biblical history, but a fairly long time. And what's going to happen to people? First of all, verse 12 says their love's going to grow cold. It's going to wax cold. If they're not careful, Jesus had given all of the signs. But if they're not careful in these challenging times, they'll forget about them, and what might happen to them? They might die when the city falls. So now we kind of move on a little bit, and we think about our time. What is it that might be with us? Well, we could be asleep. So what does asleep mean? Romans 13, verse 11, 1 Corinthians 15, Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 14. What does asleep mean? Spiritual sleep. And again, what does, let's keep on kind of probing it. What does spiritual sleep mean? You don't pay attention. I mean, again, you could think about it, you could express it in this way. You just don't what? You just don't care about it. And there's lots of things that kind of continually vie for our attention. And you just don't care about it. There's no spiritual perception. There's no spiritual discernment. And so what do people need? They need stirring up. They need stirring up. They could be worldly. James chapter 4, verse 8. What happens with the worldly? And I know that there is a core of all of this that is the same. I know that. But when they're worldly, what does it mean? Again, the focus is on physical things. So in one, you kind of limit the spiritual perception. In the other, the love and the attention is placed elsewhere. Or in Revelation chapter 2, verse 4, which sounds a lot like Matthew 24, verse 12, you're just what? You're cold. Or if we extend it a little bit further, in Revelation chapter 3 and verse 1 and verse 16, you're dead or you're what? Lukewarm. You're dead or you're lukewarm. So which one is better, dead or lukewarm? Doesn't really matter. Doesn't really matter. Thinking about lukewarm, that was a really graphic description that what happens when you're lukewarm. Right, the Lord, will spew or will vomit you out of your mouth. So this is what happens to us. And, you might always be looking. I might always be stand-up speaking about, you need to look for this big temptation. You need to watch out for this big temptation. And some people do. But for some people, the great temptation really isn't that great. It just is what? It's just everyday life. I love the image of Hebrews chapter 2, because Hebrews chapter 2, and when you start in verse 1, the Hebrew writer said, we've got to pay attention to this lest we what? Lest we drift. And the reason this means so much to me, I've never been a fisherman after I left my mom and dad's house. I went with my dad. I didn't begrudgingly go with my dad. I actually enjoyed it. But there's just some things that once you leave the connection of your parents, you just don't pick them up again. No judgment whatsoever on it. It's just the way that I was. But one of the things that I just distinctly remember, as I was a kid in 13, 14, and 15, and we would go out in the boat because my dad would love to go at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. The lake was 45 minutes away. We would be on the lake in position by about 4 o'clock in the morning. That was his time. That's when he liked to fish. And he would stick me up front with the trolling motor. And guess what I would have to do? I would have to keep us from floating into the bank, into the stumps, into the rocks. It was my job. I was the trolling motor guy. And it was so exhausting, so to speak, for a 13-year-old. Because you would run the trolling motor, you'd pull the boat back away, and it wouldn't be 5 minutes. And my dad would be on my case again. Kyle, watch it. We're getting too close to the shore. Get on the trolling motor. You got to pull the boat. It never stopped. And I'm thinking, don't they make anchors for this? And I don't know why we didn't, again, and my dad in his fishing wisdom had a plan for it, but I was the person that always had to adjust the drift, and it was exhausting. Every 5 minutes, you're going to wander into the shore, and if you don't, you're going to hit the bottom of the motor, and that's really expensive. So anyway, I've never looked at Hebrews chapter 2, verse 1 the same way. Because first of all, I know how easy it is to drift, and I know how exhausting it is to try to counteract it. But yet, when sometimes I stand up here, and I even get blinders on, and I'll talk about, hey guys, you really need to pay attention because this really big, massive temptation is out there. All the while, maybe I completely forget about the one that's never seen, it's never sensed, it's never perceived. But it's just as what? It's just as real, it's just as effective as the big one. Because if Satan can't take you down with the big thing, I promise you, he'll take you down with a what? A small one. If Satan can't take you down with the big thing, he'll take you down by a small one. Because his whole purpose is to do what? Hell is prepared for what? Devil and his angels. All he is in the business of making more angels. Making more angels. We're trying to be out there. We're trying to save people. He's trying to make more angels. He's going to make more angels by the big things, or he's going to make more angels by the small things. And that's why I think a lesson like this is useful. We need stirring up. We really do. Or else we're just going to kind of drift right into the rocks. And the positive part to look at it is that when some people drift into the rocks, I mentioned our children. So we have these, we have the middle schoolers and the high schoolers, and they drift into the rocks. And the positive part is some of them can what? Some of them can get the trolling motor and pull back out. But sadly, some what? Once they drift into the rocks, they're not coming back. And that's a tragedy. So if I had my choice of trying to keep them out of the rocks or just hoping that once they get in the rocks that they come back, which are you going to choose? Let's try to keep them out of the rocks. So because that's obviously the right choice. We all know it's the right choice. Every single one of us know it's the right choice. We do have to remember, though, as parents and grandparents, this is the really annoying part, we have a lot of influence over our children. A lot. However, we don't have what? We don't have complete influence over our children. There's a lot of things that vie for the attention of our children and our grandchildren. And I can tell you, as the father of a 26 and a 24-year-old, you've got this magic 18-year-old thing. Because, at 18, they can vote. I mean, they become a legal adult. They can be emancipated. I was teaching my kids about emancipation at 12. But anyway, at 18, They can be separated from their parent completely. And we think that once they cross that magic divide, that everything is better. And it could be. It could be. But even as the father of a 26 and a 24-year-old, you never stop worrying about the drift. You know, even when all of the signs are perfect and great, you still worry about the drift. Okay, Teresa? Yeah. And I would only add that 18 is only the theoretical number. What's the real number? What's the real number? What's the real number? 18's the set in stone one. What's the theoretical one? That's true. I do think we can extend it, though, some, but not by much. You know, your answer. I think that our answers are going to be different. However, they are going to cluster together. So I will throw out that while we're looking at the magic age of 18, the realistic age is probably more like about 12 or 13. About 12 or 13. Meaning that most everything that is formative within them exists at that point in time. Most of it. So we take the 0 to 18, but in reality, I think parents and even grandparents need to understand a slightly elevated sense of urgency in that the time may be a little bit shorter than we think. So don't be complacent about it, you know. Stir them up. That's why we need stirring, because actually stirring can produce some really, really good results. Cyrus. What did Cyrus do when he was stirred up? He let him go. He let him go back. The tabernacle was built. Why? Because the Jews were stirred up in Exodus. I mean, they'd just come out. You talk about an odd situation. They'd just come out of what? Captivity. And who would have thought that the next thing they need to do is to go on and build a tabernacle? But they were stirred up, and as they were stirred up, it was done, it was completed. Or think about some more things that are just common now. People are stirred up to be converted. Acts 2 verse 37. What happened in Acts 2 verse 37? Peter's sermon. And Peter's sermon ended with the condemnation that you have done what? You've crucified the Son of God. And so the people responded, you know, what shall we do? That's how the question ended. But how would the question have been fully expressed? What will we do to what? To be saved? What will we do to fix this? What will we do to be right with God again? It's all the same question. But we are stirred up to be converted. And sometimes people are stirred up very gently. This is where it gets very difficult in our decision making. Some people can be stirred very, very gently. Some people can't. What do you got to do with some people? It's got to be hard. It's got to be hard. It's the old proverbial, and you always hate doing it, but it's the old proverbial, they've got to be hit between the eyes with a 2x4. And that's not stirring up gently. So sometimes that means something very direct. Sometimes it means something, I've had occasions in the pulpit to do it very publicly. I think that, at least for me, you start in a nondescript, more gentle way, and then as that does not work, you become more what? You become more aggressive. You become more urgent. Now, that sometimes doesn't work, and that ends up driving someone away. To which my response would be, I tried it the easy way. I really, really did. And obviously, that wasn't working. So something else had to be done to try to stir them up. Peter didn't pull any punches. I mean, he told them, you have crucified this person. You're the one that killed them. The response was their conversion because they were stirred up. Okay, so we'll finish talking about this stirring up, go into one more little idea, and then on into Ezra chapter 4 next week.